6th century Roman or Byzantine archery, but it's really Roman archery, if you want to be more historically correct about it. And I also do middle period or 9th through 11th century Roman archery, primarily because we actually do have source materials that do describe it. Now, they don't necessarily go into great detail, but nonetheless, they are interesting and they are sources. 9th through 10th centuries, there was a tactical manual written by a certain Cidianos Magistros, and in it he has a chapter which is on archery. In it, he briefly describes a series of techniques using very specific words like some do this, some do that, and sometimes we do this. That implies that, one, they're not entirely descriptive of exactly what they are, so we kind of have to take them as general ideas. What other way are we supposed to interpret this as, other than interpreting it as literally and generalized as possible, especially if the idea is to simply give these as tactics rather than be an archery manual like the Arabs or like Tocqueville's was. What exactly are these techniques anyways, or at least how do I practice these techniques? Is the thumb draw, and specifically because the thumb draw is toward the ear. So when he says towards the ear, I'm choosing to interpret that very differently from how Procopius in the 6th century said opposite the right ear, because opposite the right ear implies that it's down here and that the string is by the forehead. And as you can see, I actually anchor at my brow, thus being at the forehead. Being toward the ear, and we know that the bows tend to be smaller bows on horseback, then the thumb draw, which Cidianos describes as being inherently pulling back much further and firing the arrow with greater force, then we can determine that it's one, toward the ear, and two, generally longer. And because it's toward the ear, what other way are we supposed to interpret this other than as literally as possible? In this case, whether it's to the breast, neck, or ear, it's where the back of the arrow is going as close to as possible. So in this case, if you're taking the arrow and bending it toward the ear, then it's literally going to be as high as the ear. So it's generally right underneath your eye. So in this case, it would look like this. And that's a very simple release. The other one would be simply to draw to the neck. We can say that this may be done with a Slavic draw or with a Mediterranean draw. One of the ways you can do it is basically a Mediterranean draw, which is the fingers or the hand is about as vertical with the bow as possible. And in this case, I'm going to choose to show you the neck draw, which is literally taking the arrow as close to the neck as possible. And it can be anchored one of two ways. The string can be on the lip right here, or the thumb can be on the chin or just underneath the chin. And this yields about a 27-inch, maybe 28, depending on the length of your arms, draw. And then lastly, you also have the least preferred technique, but one that's still very much alive, is the breast draw, which Cidianos says is something that was described as being done by the Amazons. And since they lacked the natural strength to pull back the body further, they, according to him, burned off one breast. Now, this is kind of important because it can tell us that they specifically would have anchored at the breast, and that the breast would have gotten in the way if it was something that was jutting out. So obviously they wanted a flat surface to be able to do this. So in this case, I actually choose to interpret as literally touching the hand at the chest, much like right here, see? But this is down low. So it's a very weak draw, and it's also a very weak kind of shot. So I guess it kind of goes hand in hand. So, by the way, these are terrible arrows for shooting in any sort of way. So, why different techniques? Well, the first reason is the fact that the Byzantine Empire, or the Roman Empire, was a very big place with a lot of different ethnic groups. And people from different ethnic groups, even individuals, even within an ethnic group, all very much disagree with each other on what is and what isn't good archery. And people even preferred certain techniques over the others just simply because they felt like it was a good idea. The fact that nowadays we can literally argue about what side of the bow that we shoot the arrow on is inherently more accurate than not is just a clear example of this. The fact that we're having arguments today about different archery methods, and the fact that there are even different archery methods in general, is pretty much just a testament to that idea. Reason number two is the reason that we're given in writing, and it is specifically because everybody uses all of those different techniques specifically for the practical purpose of relieving the tension on the fingers. I've mentioned this in my last video, and it's going to be here too. And basically right now it's hard for me to do a thumb draw, primarily because all my thumb rings basically broke at this point. But because I've been shooting with a naked thumb, I kind of have like a little bit of an arthritic thumb right now, and I just have to give it a little bit of rest. So right now I'm actually preferring to shoot with 3-finger draw at that point, so that way I can actually just still practice. But because of that, I'm kind of using different techniques, because as far as I'm concerned, they're not necessarily describing the 3-finger draw toward the ear, although realistically you can still technically do that, and you can even do it on either side of the bow either. In the Byzantine Empire, because it's described that all these techniques kind of existed and were done by Roman archers, and specifically for the reason that they're used specifically interchangeably to be able to relieve the tension on the fingers, then based on my experimentation, when you do any finger draw that isn't like a Slavic draw on the right of the bow, with a very simple adjustment that still keeps it as a Mediterranean draw, all you have to do is just kind of turn it down a little. And you're kind of pinching the arrow in this way, so that way you can very easily press it on back toward the bow, and it doesn't move in any direction. You're actually, when you're on an unstable surface, like on a horse, then you're able to control the arrow a little bit more. And by the way, when you do this on the left of the bow, this is just to prove my point. If you do this on the left of the bow, you can do exactly the same thing, where you turn it down and it's stable. You have a lot more leverage. See, you have a lot more leverage over the arrow, and it's a smooth release. So whether you do it on this side, on horseback, or you do it on the right side, on horseback, I think that if any culture has the possibility of portraying a 3-finger draw on the right side of the bow, then it would be the Romans, specifically because we know that they used thumb draws. And because thumb draws tend to have basically the same principles of release mechanics, as I've experimented before, when you're shooting with 3-finger draw on the right of the bow, all you have to really do is be able to apply the same mechanics that you would with a thumb draw, and therefore you have a perfectly fine shot, as I've proven time and time again. Yeah. Reason number 3 would be different techniques for different contexts and different purposes for the most part. So the purpose is based on context, which then dictates what technique you may or may not use. An example in which you have to be very technically accurate, you might choose something like a neck draw, specifically because if we were to interpret that as literally as possible, the neck draw would be taking the arrow as literally as close to the neck as possible. As you can see, it is very well in line with my vision. It is very linear with my body. It is something that wherever you look, your arrow is lining up with wherever you're looking, and therefore it is a very particularly accurate shot, something that I have found, or at least in the way that I'm interpreting it. So, because you can do something simpler here, then you can do that. At the same time, however, you can still get accurate shots with an ear draw, but obviously if you wanted more range, or you needed to power the arrow with an impetus to kind of go through armor, then clearly you would do a ear draw maybe further. And similarly, you might want to try to get off a lot of shots, and so you might prefer something that has likely a shorter draw length. Now you can technically increase your rapidity with any technique really, but obviously if you want to be really fast with it anyways, then you might prefer a shorter draw that may not even specifically anchor the bow at all. Reason number 4, and this might relate to reason number 1, is that people have different ethnic origins. They may have immigrated into the Roman Empire, or they may have recently become Roman citizens or were recruited as professional soldiers in the Roman military, but may not have actually been Roman citizens at that point. And by the way, that is not what an auxiliary is at this point. They would have probably preferred something that they're more used to, or something that they can pick up. So someone like maybe the Slav, if we know that there were a lot of Slavs in the military at the time, might have preferred something that is more akin to something that they're used to, like a Slavic draw. Someone who might be from Arabic origin that might have converted to Orthodox Christianity, may have been serving the Tagmata at the time, may prefer something that they are more used to, like thumb draws on horseback, and they may have been recruited as professional Roman military units as horse archers. May have even received some training locally even, because we do know that the thumb draw was pretty much in use. So they might have preferred something very similar to that of what they are ethnic in origin for. So reason number 5, or you could say 4.5, but we'll just say reason number 5 is that different regions might take different influences from different cultures. So for example, the Greek-speaking regions, they were all basically Greek-speaking regions, but Greek mainland, the Peloponnese and all that stuff, may have preferred more local, more historically Greek techniques, as we do know. And that could include things like historical Cretan techniques, historical finger locks and whatnot, maybe like the Mediterranean draw, although just because it's called the Mediterranean draw nowadays doesn't necessarily mean that's where it comes from. Historically speaking, drawing to the breast is something that is kind of mainland Greek, something ethnically Greek. So something like this may have been preferred by people who are more ethnically Greek, like Cappadocians and those on the mainland Peloponnese and the Delia. Whereas people maybe in the more border regions, very far east, where the Akritae basically were, those border guards and whatnot, may have preferred something and got their influence that is resemblant of something more Arabic in origin, specifically because they're in very constant contact with hostile Arab forces. And we all know that the Romans did way more than just fight their enemies, they learned from them a lot. As well as people maybe more northern, maybe more toward Bulgaria, in those northern regions like Thracia, whatnot, and maybe bordering the Caucasus, perhaps, may have resembled an idea that's a little bit more in line with how steppe people may have done it. So again, thumb draws, but maybe a different kind of thumb draws, or maybe different release mechanics. Reason number 6 is, again, based on context, and it is different techniques for different troop types. So, as we all know, the Mediterranean draw is something that tends to be something very good for standing still, specifically because you're minimally interfering with the arrow instead of holding it in place, and therefore it allows the draw to be much smoother because you're on a very stable surface and you're not moving around a lot. So, at the same time, however, something like that when you're on an unstable surface may not be so viable, specifically because you're not interfering with the arrow as much beyond just simply pitching it. So, as you see, the arrow kind of bounces around unless you pulled it off, unless you actually drew it. But the thing is that when you're trying to load it on the side of the horse, when you're on horseback, trying to do that with an unstable surface, or you have to like hold it here or whatnot, and then you have to do this. The thing is that you basically have to fight the context at that point. The reason why people on horseback, we tend to see all the time that they use thumb draws is specifically because the thumb draw itself is pretty much an answer to all of that. You're on horseback, it's kind of unstable and all that stuff. You're kind of bouncing around on a galloping horse, right? So what do you end up doing? You end up just taking the arrow out, all right? You can basically grab it here, and no matter how much you go, the side of the finger basically holds that arrow in place. So you can be on any unstable surface that you can, but because of the fact that your finger has leverage over this arrow, number one, it's easier to just take from the side and take it onto the side of the bow rather than try to go around it. So one, it's quicker, 2, it's safer, and 3, it's more stable because you can just easily just take this finger and just put that there, right? And then use the thumb draw at that point to basically hold the arrow in place. And that's why we see steppe archers, because their motive of warfare and the motive of getting around, because first their motive of getting around is by horse, and so secondly their motive of warfare is on horseback, and third, because of that, that leads to a technique that is viable for horseback, simply because it keeps the arrow in place on an unstable surface. This does basically hold it in place. However, at the same time, you can also do this with sort of pin straws. Technically, it's not impossible to do. It's not impossible to do Mediterranean draw on horseback, especially when you make that small adjustment, like turning it down. And so they're like this, right? Or you can even do that on the right of the bow, maybe with some sort of pinch, like the Slavic draw, or with that reverse Mediterranean draw even, because turning it down does the same thing. It holds it in place as much. Equipment can also affect the context of how you shoot. For example, if you have a helmet, maybe with a padded or even a male aventail, then specifically anchoring, drawing towards the ear and anchoring at the cheek may not be as viable, simply because you can't really feel it. So then how's that any different from a floating anchor? So you may prefer then just to keep to anchor in a way toward the neck at that point, as a way of being able to actually feel the anchor somewhere, at least on your face, if it's an open aventail. So basically something like, say, right here, so that way you can basically put your lip on the string, all right? And therefore you can actually feel the anchor. If you had like a male aventail, then you could technically still draw towards the ear. You just have to anchor in a different way. Instead, you anchor at the chest and draw towards the ear. And therefore you cant the bow a little bit and you can actually see it underneath your eye. And this is also something, if you have like a fully enclosed aventail, which we know that Byzantine cataphracti did, we do know to some degree that the cataphracti also used bows as well. But a lot of them would have had the closed face aventail. So a great way of being able to anchor is at the chest. And it's not because you can necessarily feel it on your chest armor, it's simply because the string keeps it from going back any further. So anchor at the chest. Reason number 7 basically dictates that certain techniques are more for beginners than anything, primarily because if we look at the breast draw as an example, he said that it was used by the Amazons who lacked the strength to do it. And one of the qualities of a beginner archer is that they're generally not going to be as strong, right? So it's something that if you're a beginner archer but are trying to pull back a heavy bow, then you may not be able to get it as far. So in something like the breast draw, and we do know that Nikephoros, based on Leila Deacon's example, household retainers be able to give military training, and they drew the arrow to the chest, so to say. So we do know that this is kind of like a sort of beginner's kind of technique, whatnot. And it was kind of like a daily training kind of thing. But it kind of implies that they were kind of beginners and new to the job. And so therefore, because they were weaker than that, they had to use basically a weaker technique just to get used to actually being able to pull back a bow and actually be able to shoot it. So they may not have been able to use something that was very strong up until they actually got used to it. Something that I've found is that whenever you use a technique that is something that you can technically shoot on the left side of the bow, because the mechanics are much more simple, you know, less movement technically, and I'll show you. Less movement that you have to do in order to make that work, compared to shooting on the right of the bow, which you have to do these a little bit more complex hotshot mechanics in order to be able to keep the arrow straight, solely because the back of the arrow then pushes into the bow rather than it just sliding off when it's on the left side of the bow. So for that reason, something like, you know, the neck draw or the breast draw, or even anything that is like a 3-finger draw that specifically is putting it on the left side of the bow, is something that requires skill, I'd say. I know that's gonna piss some people off, but to be completely honest, shooting on the left of the bow is really just kind of a beginner's kind of thing. And the reason why they're not able to do very well when moving on to shooting on the right side is simply because the mechanics that you have to perform are just very different. And you can easily do that in, you know, it's a perfectly stable arrow without having to necessarily put any extra complex release mechanics into it. It just kind of slides right off, which is not something that you can actually get out of shooting on the right side of the bow as easily. What it requires is a different kind of shooting mechanic to be able to make it work.